People often imagine armed conflicts being won or lost on the battlefield. Armies advance, enemies retreat, and eventually one side wins. But modern wars rarely end that way. They end when three things start breaking at the same time: munitions, markets, and midterms. These pressure points determine how long hostilities can realistically continue. In the first 5 days of this war, the United States burned through roughly 800 Patriot interceptors. Once munitions begin to run low, commanders must face difficult choices. They can either slow the pace of operations or redeploy assets from elsewhere. The Pentagon has opted for the latter. It is cannibalizing missile systems across Asia-Pacific to sustain combat operations. This video shows 6 THAAD launchers being removed from the US base in South Korea and being redeployed to the Middle East. Markets, however, don't care about battlefield victories. They're concerned with stability. If investors believe a conflict might escalate into a prolonged crisis, they begin preparing for the economic consequences long before those consequences fully appear. Data centers shut down, shipping companies change routes, capital starts moving towards safer assets, and so on. The closing of the Strait of Hormuz, for instance, doesn't just affect fuel prices. It ripples through freight, food, housing, and even water infrastructure. Modern life rests on stable energy flows, and once those begin to fluctuate, the effects spread outward. So, while military planners focus on operational objectives, political leaders must also consider how the conflict is upsetting inflation, energy prices, and the broader economy. Even superpowers must negotiate with reality. We may be living in what feels like the most anxiety-inducing era in recent memory. Not necessarily the most dangerous period in history, but one that often feels that way. Between alarming headlines, endless commentary, and the temptation to keep doom scrolling, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by everything happening around us. I caught myself in that spiral recently, just scrolling through updates late at night, one headline after another. At some point, you're no longer staying informed, you're just feeding the anxiety. One thing that can help is simply having space to step back and process it all. For many people, therapy provides that space, a chance to reflect, gain perspective, and better understand the patterns shaping how we think and respond to stress. BetterHelp, the sponsor of today's episode, makes it easier to start therapy. You can take a short quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist, and you can communicate in the way that works best for you, whether by phone, video, or text. And if the match isn't right, you can switch therapists at any time at no extra cost. More than 6 million people have already gotten help through BetterHelp. If you're interested, click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/CaspianReport to get 10% off your first month of therapy. The first pressure point in modern warfare is munitions. Everything hinges on this. At first glance, the US military appears almost limitless in firepower. Precision missiles can strike targets hundreds of kilometers away, satellites track movements in real time, while air defense systems intercept rockets mid-flight. It almost looks as if advanced militaries can simply keep fighting for as long as they want. But there is a quiet reality behind all of this. Modern weapons are extraordinarily difficult to produce. A Tomahawk missile is not just a metal tube filled with explosives. It contains specialized electronics, advanced guidance systems, and components that come from long supply chains. Many of those parts are produced in small quantities by only a handful of manufacturers. The same is true for interceptor missiles, long-range drones, and precision-guided bombs, which means these weapons cannot be replaced quickly. At the start of a conflict, this problem is easy to miss. Militaries rely on stockpiles built up over years. Those reserves allow them to sustain a high tempo of strikes in the early stages of a war. Missiles fly, air defenses intercept, and so commanders operate as if supply is not an issue. But stockpiles don't last forever, and once they begin to shrink, the war starts to run into industrial constraints. Factories cannot scale production overnight. Doing so would require time, skilled labor, and, above all, multi-year contracts with suppliers. Take the SM-3 interceptor missile as an example. The US Navy uses it to shoot down ballistic missiles. Depending on the variant, each missile costs roughly $10 to $28 million. That price tag reflects its complexity. The missile must detect a ballistic warhead in space, track it, and collide with it at several kilometers per second using a kinetic kill vehicle. It's essentially a small spacecraft designed to destroy another object traveling faster than a bullet. But because of that complexity, the production of SM-3 missiles is limited. The exact number is classified, but they're produced in relatively small batches, often only dozens per year, depending on the Pentagon's procurements. Another example is the Patriot PAC-3 interceptor, one of the main missiles used by America and Israel to shoot down Iranian missiles. Each PAC-3 interceptor costs roughly $4 to $5 million. However, in spite of its widespread use, production is relatively limited. In 2025, manufacturer Lockheed Martin produced around 620 PAC-3 interceptors. That seems plenty at first, but modern air defense systems often fire multiple interceptors at a single incoming missile to ensure a successful kill. In a prolonged high-intensity conflict, this equation gradually shifts the nature of the war. One night of missile defense can burn through months of production. This video shows over a dozen Patriot interceptors launched from the local US airbase during an Iranian missile barrage. That's about 2% of the Patriot's annual production gone in under a minute. No war machine runs this hot forever. The same munitions constraint exists on the Iranian side, though it looks very different. Iran possesses one of the largest ballistic missile arsenals in the Middle East, estimated at several thousand. But missiles alone do not determine how much firepower a country can bring to the battlefield. They also need launchers. These launch vehicles must constantly move, hide, and reposition. The moment a missile is fired, sensors and satellites can often trace the launch back to its origin, making the vehicle itself a prime target. Destroy enough of these launchers, and even a large missile stockpile becomes useless. Iran has also invested heavily in drones, which push the economics of war even further. Systems like the Shahed 136 are rudimentary when compared to missiles, but they're built with small engines and basic electronics, and are estimated to cost between $20,000 and $50,000 each, with some estimates going as low as $7,000. Launched in waves, these drones force defenders to spend far more expensive interceptors, gradually saturating air defenses and exhausting stockpiles faster than they can be replenished. Altogether, these dynamics show that modern warfare depends as much on industry as on tactics. Victory belongs to the side that can sustain the flow of weapons. Armed conflicts today face another pressure point that did not exist to the same degree in the past: financial markets. The moment fighting breaks out in a strategically important region, energy prices move within hours, transportation costs rise, and investors start reassessing risks. Oftentimes, these market fluctuations happen long before governments decide how to respond. We're already seeing this dynamic unfold. Oil prices jumped as soon as hostilities began to disrupt traffic near the Strait of Hormuz. Governments moved quickly to calm markets by releasing strategic reserves and signaling that additional supplies could be brought online if needed. Those measures helped stabilize prices for the moment, but the episode illustrates how sensitive global markets are. And this is not just about oil. Once energy markets begin moving, the effects trickle down. Freight becomes more expensive, manufacturing costs rise, and inflation begins creeping upward again. All these disruptions move far faster than military campaigns, and they ripple through global supply chains. Fertilizer production, for example, depends heavily on natural gas. When energy prices rise, the cost of producing ammonia, the key ingredient in nitrogen fertilizers, rises as well. That increase eventually reaches farmers, which, months from now, raises the cost of staple crops such as wheat, corn, and rice. Global aviation is another example. The Middle East sits at the crossroads of major air routes connecting Europe, Asia, and Africa. About 2/3 of the global population lives within an 8-hour flight of Doha and Dubai. So, when missiles, drones, or air defense systems threaten regional airspace, carriers are forced to reroute flights around the danger zones. This is how the region's airspace looks right now. Azerbaijan is effectively the single direct link between Europe and Asia. But it's more than just that. The trickle-down consequences don't necessarily stay local. Distant sectors feel them too. Much of the recent momentum in the American stock market and a hefty portion of US economic growth is driven by a handful of tech giants often referred to as the Magnificent Seven. These companies dominate the market. In 2023 alone, they accounted for around 60% of the S&P 500's total return, which goes to show just how concentrated the market rally has become. However, the expansion of these tech giants depends on massive investments in artificial intelligence infrastructure, particularly the data centers that power cloud computing and machine learning. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Bahrain have been actively courting these tech giants to host regional cloud and AI hubs in an effort to position themselves as digital infrastructure centers. But Iran treats this digital infrastructure as part of the conflict itself. Iranian drones have already damaged Amazon data centers in the UAE and Bahrain, which have disrupted cloud services used by banks and companies in the region. Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Nvidia, IBM, Oracle, and Palantir are now all legitimate targets according to the IRGC. By threatening or damaging the overseas infrastructure of these firms, Iran is attempting to hurt the digital backbone of the American tech sector and, by extension, a key engine of US economic growth. Pipelines, shipping, fertilizers, data centers, that's just the start. The ripple effects run even deeper into the global economy. Petrochemical production relies heavily on oil and gas feedstocks. Semiconductor supply chains depend on predictable shipping routes and specialized industrial materials. Gulf sovereign wealth funds manage trillions of dollars in assets worldwide, so any instability that forces them to move their capital can echo across financial markets. Taken together, these examples reveal just how many critical systems underpin the global economy. A prolonged conflict with Iran will shape prices, supply chains, and growth across the planet. And as those disruptions mount, the White House will gradually yield to investors and markets. Politics is the third and final pressure point. It's less visible than weapons or markets, but just as powerful. While military campaigns can stretch for years, elections arrive on schedule. And that mismatch eventually creates pressure. At the start of a conflict, political leaders usually enjoy broad public support. Governments have room to act, and military operations move forward with relatively little domestic resistance. But that unity rarely lasts forever. As hostilities drag on, questions begin to surface. What are the objectives? How long will this continue? What are the costs? Those questions grow louder once the war begins to affect everyday life, whether through rising fuel costs, higher inflation, or the steady drip of casualties. In the United States, the next political clock is always ticking. Every 2 years, Americans elect a new Congress. The next one is scheduled for November 2026. In that election, all 435 seats in the House of Representatives and roughly 1/3 of the seats in the Senate will be on the ballot. These midterm elections often become a referendum on the sitting president's policies, especially during periods of economic stress or military conflict. A war that drags on too long can quickly turn into a political liability, even if the fighting itself remains far away. Lawmakers, particularly those from swing districts and swing states, are usually the first to distance themselves from unpopular policies. Not necessarily because the war has been lost, but because the domestic political environment can no longer sustain it. For a president, that creates a dilemma. Armies can fight for as long as their supplies last, economies can absorb shocks for a time, but political legitimacy must be renewed at the ballot box. So, if the war with Iran drags on long enough to collide with the midterm election, the pressure will not only come from the battlefield or the markets, it will also come from Capitol Hill. When viewed together, munitions, markets, and midterms will determine the outcome of this conflict. Each of these pressure points can shape political decisions. Iran understands this dynamic and leans into it. The attacks on tankers and data centers are meant to stretch missile supply chains, unsettle global markets, and wait for political pressure in Washington to build. And as these pressure points converge at the same time, they will begin to narrow Trump's room for maneuver. Before long, total victory is spun into acceptable outcome. That would be the trade-off. There is a sense of irony in all this. The war meant to weaken Iran could instead leave the country with Khamenei just 30 years younger. I've been your host Shervan from Caspian Report. If you enjoy these videos, consider supporting the channel on Patreon and click the bell icon so the next one doesn't slip past you. Thank you for your time and Saul.